Good evening. I hope you can all hear me. I'd like to welcome you all to this evening's lecture, London in the Roman World, and I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to all of you here in the BP Theatre and also to those of you who are watching online. I'm here tonight to represent the British Museum Friends Advisory Council. We serve to provide a voice for members within the museum, and we meet regularly to advise the museum on how to provide the best membership offering that we can. And tonight's lecture is part of that offering. It's my very great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Professor Dominic Perring. Professor Perring is the director of the University College London Centre for Applied Archaeology, and he's a former lecturer in archaeology at the University of Leicester, the University of York, and the American University of Beirut. He has spent over 50 years, if that's right, leading archaeological research into Roman cities, including major programs of research in London, Beirut, and Milan. He's written more than 100 academic papers and contributed to various television broadcasts on these and related topics. His latest book, London and the Roman World, has just been published and will be available to purchase later this evening. And signed, he's available for signing. In this lecture, Professor Perring will explore London's creation and evacuations in the city and how they're helping us to understand the wars and plagues that weakened the Roman state. So, Professor Perring.
Well, what a splendid turnout, and thank you so much for wanting to spend the evening with me. Writing books, and this is a book promotional thing, I'm afraid, as you'll see in a second, it's a very lonely process. You spend years, this one took me 10 years, working away at words and prose and research, and it ends up being for an audience of one. I wrote it for me, to realise that other people might also be interested, especially after lockdown and all the rest of it, is such a thrill to see so many people who care about these things. Awesome. So thank you so much for being here. It is a treat for me. It's also a treat for me because we're talking about the place I actually love the most. You love and hate London. It's a big city. It's got all of the grief and all of the wonder of big cities. But I am a Londoner of many generations, and it's a bit of a privilege as an archaeologist to be drawn back to the place that I personally am from and feel that I belong to, and indeed to this part of London. And in front of you, you have the bit that matters, the bit we're talking about today, which of course is the middle, and it's the city. It's the City of London. And the slide you have in front of you has somewhere near my name, at the bottom left, the Tower of London, which marks one end of the Roman city, which then sweeps up through London Wall, past the skyscrapers, and then back across towards where the word London is written at the top of that slide. That's the City of London. And we're looking at that massive urban conurbation, and we're talking about its origins. How did this city come into being? What purposes did it serve? Because London is, in creation, a Roman city. And we are, there we go, that's promotion. Thank you. But I've been working on this site as an archaeologist for, I'm afraid, those 50-odd years. I started as a schoolboy, digging as a volunteer, as we were allowed to do then, with laxer health and safety rules and approaches. And I've spent many of the subsequent years coming to and fro London. I've dipped in and dipped out and learned a lot in the process. And this is a site that has been looked at by archaeologists probably as long as any other archaeological site. We're going back into the 1580s when people started writing their reports on casual discoveries in London, or bits of burials and the like. And then in particular, there's the enormously important work in the Victorian period as the city became the big financial centre it is, and big new offices were being built, and the first wave of development-led archaeology, where Charles Roach Smith was the leading figure in salvaging what could be salvaged from the construction sites. And of course, Charles Roach Smith amassed a wonderful collection of objects and artifacts from his research into London, and then sold them to the British Museum, where they now still sit as the core of the Romano-British galleries in this very building. So I feel it terribly important that I'm here back where so much of that important material is housed, and those galleries I hope you'll want to revisit, having heard a little bit more about some of the story behind them. But that development-led archaeology has carried on, antiquarian research, development going on. In front of you, the slide of the discovery of the Temple of Mithras, a year before I came onto the scene as a person at all. And we've carried on digging, and there have been thousands of excavations in London, millions of stratified finds of assemblages, and in particular, thousands of dendrochronology dates. And it's that bottom line there, tree ring dating. Tree ring dating is what makes London into something very different from pretty much any other archaeological site. We have absolute dates. People would cut trees down to build with them. They wouldn't stockpile them, they were felled on demand. Each major building project in the city has woodlands being coppiced, timbers being floated downriver, brought into London to build. And those thousands of dated construction activities spreading across the period of London's occupations of the Roman city give us a chronological narrative second to none. And so I will be, I'm afraid today, rushing through history. I'm an archaeologist, really, so some of my history is it's all right, but I will take correction, I'm sure, in questions at the end. But it is that ability to marry what we discover through stratigraphic excavation, the layers and the structures, to marry that to some absolute dates. And London, because of its intensity of research, is pretty unique in that regard. It's a splendid site for research. Right, here's the story. We start with, where does this city come from? Where is London born? And a lot of work has gone on in the City of London, and none of it has produced any sense of there being an Iron Age settlement that precedes London. There are some Bronze Age farmsteads, there's Iron Age activity in the area, but London itself sat on a river that was difficult to cross, a river that was naturally a boundary rather than a connectivity. And London, as far as we can tell, sat on the edge of different polities. The major kingdoms of the late Iron Age were described on coins as kingdoms and ruled from Colchester. Archaeologists tend to call this area the Eastern Kingdom, or from Silchester, which is often referred to as the Southern Kingdom. The political structure I'll not get too engaged with, but we have these different polities, and the Thames is likely to have been a boundary area. If you look at the slide in front of you, the triangles represent the distribution of the coins of Cunoblin, who ruled from Colchester, who also had political sway over the neighbouring communities, Verulamium as it became, Duravernum, Canterbury as it is. And that political area stood in contrast with the areas ruled from Silchester, from Caleva, which is marked by the coins in round. And it doesn't take an awful lot of searching of that slide to realise that London is on a borderland, really, between those two areas of distributions, and it's also on a borderland between the pottery-producing areas shown by the hatching. So, not an important centre before Rome. We first hear of London when it's described in sources describing the Boudiccan revolt of AD 60-61, and we will get more on Boudica and her revolt shortly. And that's Tacitus and Dio and others refer to the site at that time. We have no earlier references. By happy coincidence, archaeology has come up with the name Londinio on a writing tablet from the recent excavations at the Bloomberg building, a reworking of the site of the Temple of Mithras, which you've just been looking at. And there you can perhaps see on that little bit of timber there on the left-hand side, you can see the scratching of Londinio as an address on a letter. It's a Celtic name. There's a lot of dispute about quite what it means in origin, but it's a landscape name, not necessarily a settlement name. And one of the suggestions which I prefer is low-lying lands, but as I say, it is a disputed origin, but a Celtic word that refers to an aspect of the landscape that Rome encountered. Archaeology within the area of the centre of London has begun to produce a map, you see in front of you, of where there may have been Iron Age farmsteads. Some of these may have carried on being in occupation up until the time of the conquest, and indeed all of them continue to be important sites within the Roman period and into the post-Roman period. When I get to the end of this talk, as we run through 400 years odd of Roman history, you'll see a slide with a very similar pattern of dots to this one, which is what's going on in the early medieval period out of the end of antiquity. And I'll refer to these sites again. And the nearest of those to where we are now, of course, is St Martin in the Fields by Trafalgar Square. But I'm more interested right now in the site in Southwark, and there we do have in excavations in the early 1980s by Carrie Cowan and colleagues from the Museum of London, a site which produced comparatively late Iron Age material associated perhaps with hut circles, perhaps a farmstead. But you'll notice that the site of London itself, in the capital letters, has no such settlement that we know associated with it. I'm a Londoner. I'm a proper Londoner. I'm from north of the river. There's a horrible part of me, a sinking feeling that suggests that maybe London has origins south of the river. Not, I hasten to add, as an urban site. The city, of course, is north of the river. And this takes us up to what happens to that landscape. And in AD 43, it is the conquest of southern Britain by the armies sent here by the Emperor Claudius, and they are conquering and uniting those polities of southern Britain. So my southern and eastern kingdoms become ruled from a single place. There is a road system, and you can see immediately the geography of southern Britain suggests that London sits in a sensible place in the middle of what Rome encountered in the south. And London's history as a city is because it is uniting territories in southern Britain, eventually England, and it is that role as a unifying central place to the polities of the region, to the peoples of the region, that gives London its raison d'etre. And that is why it's a very successful Roman city, but it's also why it ceases to be a successful city of any sort at the end of the Roman period, as that political unity in the southern part of the country falls apart. So how does it actually get put here? Who put it here and why? And archaeology has long argued about this, and there is no consensus. And I now represent one extreme of the range of arguments, but I'm the one you've got, so you can hear my extreme. The arguments I'm returning to see it as being very central to the administration, and therefore having a strong relationship to the military side of that administration. Britain is a frontier province, all the way from the Claudian conquest of AD 43, right the way into the late first century, into the early second century. It is the base from which military campaigns are being conducted. Not necessarily always occupied by soldiers, in fact, often not, but it is the place that is supplying, managing, administering, and organizing those activities. That still leaves us with two major players. There is the army, and there's the mercantile community that is supporting the army. And for a long time, it has been seen as, was it a fort that became a city? That became an unpopular model. And from over 100 years ago, Francis Haverfield wrote the phrase you see up on there: London began not at the nod of a ruler, but through the shrewdness of merchants. And that sense that the city of London belongs because its mercantile endeavour really belonged. The city of London is fond of that perception of itself, shrewdness of merchants. And archaeology, working on the site all the way through the 70s and the 80s, continually failed to find any fort out of which the city could have been built. So we in our profession, pretty much all of us agreed, and I even wrote a book along these lines, that London was a creation of the late AD 40s, 48, 50, that sort of period, where merchants were coming in to provide the support for the new administration of the province. However, and you can guess that however is coming here, I think, from the way I'm taking you, in 2006, excavations at this site, and the Walbrook is a building site well, it's now a building. It was a building site opposite the Bloomberg Centre. It's that part of the city. And you see here a chap called Ian Blair, who I've known for a very long time. He's been around as long as I have. Ian is standing between two ditches, and to his left, there is, you can probably just see a V-shaped ditch with an ankle cleaner, and to the right, he has a colleague standing in another ditch. Those two ditches sit on this splendid promontory on the north bank of the river. The site itself, the Walbrook, is the WA006 ditches you can see there. On the bottom, you see another ditch which was found by London Bridge in 1994, which people at the time had just seen, oh, it's a ditch, it's just a ditch. And another pair of ditches from a site just off Bishopsgate, found in 1989. And you can see what I make of them. Ditches form a square. That looks a bit fort-like. And that takes me back onto what might be going on at the time of the conquest. Those ditches are very poorly dated because the conquest period is not rich in material culture. The army is moving along in tents. They're using bivouac equipment, not lots of ceramics. The local ceramic production hasn't started. They're not building lots of timber structures, so we don't have the dendrochronology. So we've got ditches, some Iron Age pottery, but that doesn't tell us very much because some of those Iron Age pots carried on in production and use into the Flavian period. But we also know of the historical accounts that accompany the conquest of Britain. And those historical accounts, primarily that written by Dio Cassius, and it is in Greek and it is sometime after the events, but it is probably informed by earlier sources, describes how the conquering general Aulus Plautius reached the Thames, and describes the crossing of the Thames in which the army is able to cross by bridge. And we then have this big question, well, where is that bridge? I like this slide because it shows you in green the solid ground, but that light blue is all of it marshland, it's flooded at high tides, it's difficult, intractable terrain. And if you look at where you would get across the river, I'm afraid this takes us back to our site in Southwark, but if you want to cross the river, the Ayats of Southwark, now under Borough Market, give you a stepping stone, as it were, to the north bank. And if you look along the rest of the river, you can see how difficult it would be to cross the Thames at high tide in floodwater. And going back to it, though, we don't have an Iron Age settlement in the north bank. We don't have any reason to believe there's a bridge there. The bridge is more likely to be a pontoon bridge. It's the sort of thing that the Roman army was very regularly building to help its forces move around. And we know from the account by Dio Cassius that the armies then waited for Claudius on the banks of the Thames. Wherever it was, they'd established their fort, their base. And you see in black there the outline I've just shown you in those earlier slides of those ditches. And you see in red the later Roman road system that gets built around the site of London. So this does look to be a sensible bridging point. It fits with the narrative we get from Dio Cassius. And we know that the armies that waited for Claudius were joined by him by boat here on the Thames. Claudius was in the province for just a few days, and he arrived, quickly took command of his armies, marched on Colchester, celebrated his victory, and then swiftly returned to Rome. He had worrying politics to deal with. So the timeline of Claudius's presence in Britain again points to somewhere on the Thames being a sensible place for him to have arrived, disembarked, apparently with elephants and siege towers, although I have to rely on historical sources for that. We don't find them archaeologically. And again, if you look at the crossing of the river, bearing in mind that that red line going to the east, to the right of that slide, is heading off to Colchester to cross the River Lee. That is the route that Claudius would have wished to take. And you look at those red lines, that's a sensible bridging point, and it's very difficult to see how you do it lower down river. Westminster is an alternative candidate. I shall dismiss it briskly now. If you want the longer story, you can ask me questions about that. So, AD 43, potentially a fort established for the army of conquest. That, however, is a very brisk part of the story. But I didn't give you my bit I can't write in the book, but I can tell you here because you're all friends, aren't you? I love to think that that site by Borough Market, Southwark Street, is sort of where Claudius would have landed, because he's got to come upriver, he's got to dock somewhere. South of the river is where you're safer, you're more established. He arrives there, the pontoon bridge is in place, so I think Borough Market is where Emperor Claudius got off his boat and walked across with his elephants across the river. And I didn't put that in the book because it's just a touch speculative. What we know happens next begins to get clearer. Everything I've told you about London's origin is disputed, and there are still many who would not see it as having come into existence until a little bit later. And that little bit later is given to us by dendrochronology, which is where we kick in with these wonderful tree ring dates. And the dendrochronology we've got that gives us our earliest secure construction date are these from the site at 1 Poultry, top right-hand side of that slide. There's an arrow showing you where that is. That is underneath 1 Poultry by Bank Tube Station. And that is the major road leading into the town, or leading out of the town, on its west side. That's the road that becomes Oxford Street, and it still is Oxford Street, and it goes all the way, well, originally to Silchester rather than Oxford, but there we go. That road had to depend on quite significant engineering, because there were a lot of springs up from that, what I call on that slide, sacred precinct and pond. There's springs, natural springs in the area of Gresham Street, and they need to be channeled down, and those timbers you see on the top right-hand side, found in 1994 at 1 Poultry, dated to AD 48, are part of these major conduits that they used to get the road to go underneath the line of this important road, and they're built in AD 48. And the other element of the slide, the bottom right, is what's happening in terms of waterfront revetments, and those waterfront revetments are built in AD 52. And that's Regis House, again by London Bridge. Those are both important dates. AD 48 looks to be our first use of London as a major centre. They lay out roads and streets, they lay out buildings. But in AD 52, they rebuild pretty much everything. Some of those earlier roads get replaced by newer, bigger roads, wider things. And what you see on the left there is the town of AD 52. And the town of AD 48 may not even have been a town. I suspect it might even have been a supply depot, a base for storing, for moving goods through. But it's rebuilt. And that rebuilding in AD 48 and AD 52 are both of them intriguing dates. And I could carry on doing this at every 3 or 4 year interval all the way through 450 years of history, but I won't bore you quite that much. But these are dates because they are both of them the dates when new provincial governors were arriving in Britain, setting out a new agenda, acting on the emperor's instructions. This is still Claudius, and these new governors are setting out on military campaigns, but what they do before they start those campaigns is they organize their supply, their rear, their support base. And that's what London is showing, is this cyclical investment, which we can see through dendrochronology, as these early stages progress. And this happens in later phases as well, although not quite so clearly. Gosh, I've run through quite a bit there, and I'm sorry, I forgot to apologize to start with. I always get stuck on the early stuff. If you like late antiquity, you may have to ask questions, because I get carried away with the early stuff. I'll try and be a bit quicker now, moving through the revolt. This is where, as I've said, London enters history. We know about it through historical sources. We know that Boudica and her rebels descended on the city and burnt it. And archaeology comes in with some splendidly supportive evidence, because we have timber buildings built in AD 60-61 that are burnt down, and then we have lots of new engineering going on in AD 62 to AD 64. So archaeology would tell us that something horrible had happened that required rebuilding, even if the ancient sources didn't give us the clues. And the plantation place fort, seen on the right-hand side of that slide, is where probably German auxiliaries were based. We know of the activities of those auxiliaries through various of the writing tablets discovered at the Bloomberg. If you've not been to the Bloomberg, you've got to go. Some of the writing tablets from that site, written up by Roger Tomlin, are stunning. fascinating information about what's going on in terms of the post-revolt period. And we've also got these other constructions. There's a log causeway built in AD 62, which looks to be a sort of a north circular, shall I call it? A log track bypassing the city, but easing, presumably, the passage of troops at these critical junctures in the post-revolt period. Interestingly, some of the carpentry on that log track suggests native carpentry, not using the Roman axes and the sawing techniques introduced by the Romans. So there may be slaves being put to work, allied troops, who knows? But something's going on there a little bit different to help navigate those soggier bits. That log track that you can see at the top there with the red arrow is actually getting across the headwaters of the Walbrook, which I will be talking about again shortly. And we've got waterworks being built in AD 64, and we've got massive new timber quays going up. And these all look like military engineering. The waterworks are serving probably a local bathhouse, but these were found at Blossom's Inn and involve these lovely contraptions. There's these big shafts and this turning treadmill that pulls up the water, probably to fuel the Cheapside Baths or some other bathhouse nearby. And then at Regis House, these quays of AD 64, intriguingly built into the waterfront, nice new warehouses, a Neronian quay, built over a few skulls and interesting bits of semi-articulated humans, but we'll leave them alone for the time being. But the London we've got now has come out of these early stages of Rome creating a pacified province, providing the supply and support for the activity of the administration, and that generates a very unusual settlement. Its unusualness is sufficient for Tacitus, who was writing about it, pointing out that it wasn't distinguished by the title of colony, but it was famed for its abundance of dealers and supplies. And he's making an important point here. London becomes quite a perverse settlement in the Roman world. Most cities start with some form of political endowment. They have a chartered status. They're either colonia or municipia. And London kind of slips through the net as being not quite that. And Tacitus wants us to know that. It's a bit different. But the people living in London are important, very important. On the top left of that slide, you've got the tomb of Classicianus. Classicianus was the appointed procurator, Chancellor of the Exchequer, poor thing, head of finance administration, and he dies in service in London and is buried here, and his tomb was found, and it has the dedication from his wife. And this gives us a very clear background to this. This is somebody probably from Trier or the area of Trier. And we've got a lot going on in London at that date that talks to that area of Northeast Gaul, German frontier. And that's probably where the bulk of the community that's helping run the service side of the Roman administration come from. So his tombstone, not located in position because those bits of stone were reused in the later town wall, but his tombstone probably somewhere in the Tower Hill area. One of my favourite tombs from London comes from the other side of town. It's from the area just behind the Old Bailey, Warwick Square. And these I do know are in the galleries upstairs and are really worth a look. They're the sorts of things you walk past going, oh yeah, more dead people, you know. The lead canisters here contain symbols and marks which do look perhaps to be associated with Platonic philosophy and certain ideas that were current at that time about the hereafter, the quadriga, the chariot rising to the sun to lift the soul immortal. But more importantly, the bottom right is a porphyry urn made in Egypt of a style a bit like a soup tureen, but in perfect Pythagorean proportions. And it's the sort of tombstone, the cinerary urn, that's normally associated with the imperial house. These are very precious, rare objects. It's come all the way from Egypt at an early date. It's probably Claudio-Neronian. And this is a small cemetery that I would like to suspect, and again, this isn't quite in the book, although I try and point in that direction. This I think, is quite possibly the tombs of either a governor or a procurator or somebody very senior in the administration, but with these strong Eastern Mediterranean connections. So a different form of community, and I'd like to think that that is a governor. But at the top, we still have our Britons around, not many, but this is a body excavated in a training excavation at Harper Road, where the work on the isotopic analysis and all of these splendid things that people can now do with teeth and bones looks to have been somebody who was born and raised in Britain. And she was buried with a collection of artifacts which include both Roman and British influenced and inspired things. And the talk, number one she's wearing there, has symbols which do look to be of a nature associated with the pre-Roman elite. Notice Southwark, you see, that's our Iron Age farmsteady sort of area, and the wrong side of the river for these Romans. So I shall fast forward through the later Neronian period. Nero looks to cease to be particularly interested in Britain, but we do get a major change in London, a massive change in the beginning of the Flavian period, with Vespasian, who sends a new governor across, and we have the amphitheatre, which again you can visit beneath Guildhall Yard, in the art gallery there, as excavated on the left there, as reconstructed on the right. And this, the timbers used in the construction of this start being procured in AD 70-71, but the building itself is completed in AD 74. And this is, for those of you who like your Roman history more, a splendid set of dates, because this is pretty contemporary with the Colosseum in Rome. I'm not suggesting anything of the same architectural pretension, but we are looking at an idea of how imperial power is being projected. We're looking at an argument of imperial power. And Vespasian, as a new dynast who's taken over, established himself without the benefit of legitimacy through his parentage and his adoption, he is looking to make his role within the army and within the empire very clear. He's out there using Britain. Of course, Vespasian had served in Britain during the Claudian conquest, so he's using Britain to make statements, and he's using London to make statements of the projection of imperial power. The amphitheatre. And I do beg you, when you look at amphitheatres, to remember that gladiatorial games are only a small part of what's going on, and a big part of those games is about celebrating the imperial cult. A big part of what's going on in the gladiator is the execution of enemies of the state. It is about the projection of violence and aggression and authority. And Vespasian is using this as an instrument to establish his authority and show that Britain is once again part of an agenda. And that agenda gives us Roman London's 50 years of happiest development. I say happy. I have to confess here, I love London. Roman London was built to suppress and occupy a conquered province. It was built to serve the needs of the administration, and those needs were not always sweetness and light. That amphitheatre wasn't just about partying, it was about blood. And another aspect of that is gearing up for further conquest. And the Flavian successors to Vespasian see a period of rapid expansion of London, just as governors are beginning to complete the conquest of the British Isles. And what London is doing now is it's keeping the goods going. It's moving the materials through. Wine and oil. The soldiers needed to be kept on side. They needed to have luxury imports. You couldn't just expect them to make do with what they found locally, as happens later on. And in those supplies, the port is the motor and the engine for all of that. And above all, they need feeding, they need clothing, they need military equipment. And the logistics is what got Rome an empire, knowing how to manage and marshal its resources. Do what you can locally, and the landscape around London is changing radically at this time as well. as we are seeing probably taxation in kind spreading out, the road systems radiating from London start seeing these small roadside settlements being developed, which probably have administrative buildings in them, part of posting stations. And a big phase of growth in London comes through under the Governor Agricola. And London has these mills being built on a tidal mill, perhaps on the base of the Fleet, and another mill, not entirely certain it's there, but there's bits of what look like mill equipment coming out of the Bloomberg excavations, another mill on the Walbrook River, the one that dissects the city through the middle. And these have the capacity to produce abundant milled flour. We know from earlier on that the import of grain is a key part of what the Port of London's doing. In the Boudiccan Revolt, there's a granary burnt down which contains grain with weeds that show that it had grown in the Eastern Mediterranean, not in the Northwest provinces. So the army is being kept fed, and the instruments of power ensure it happens, and London is doing that sort of thing. And this lovely model you see in front of you is from the excavations at Pudding Lane, a reconstruction based on the work of Gustav Milne, but I find it a very accurate idea of what this busy port city was like and doing. And I won't get into the detail of it, but there are other investments in London's port which suggest that this remains a major aspect of London's existence, and that new emperors and new governors were very keen to put their stamp on London as a way of putting their support for the army. And Britain has more legions based in it than pretty much anywhere else in the empire, so it is vitally important that the army here is supported. And that gets us up to Hadrian. And Hadrian is the first of several turning points in what's going on in London. We know from the biographies written of him and the histories written of him that he visits London circa AD 122. Hadrian's Wall comes out of the sorts of strategic choices going on at that time. We also know that at about that time, London's massive forum, and it had a smaller forum built in the Flavian period, replaced by this massive forum, probably started by Trajan and completed by Hadrian. It's the largest building of its sort west of the Alps, northwest of the Alps. There's still bits of it that can be seen underneath Leadenhall Court Market. I once was making a TV show talking about the Hadrianic period in London, and they decided that it'd be very clever if I went into this barber's shop at Leadenhall Court Market, and you go down and into the cellar, and they've got a little bit of the forum that you can still see. And if you go for a shave, as I went for a shave, next to this, and I was being filmed having a shave next to this bit of the Hadrianic, Trajanic forum. I don't often have wet shaves, you might notice that. Filming can be quite a slow process. Trying to be shaved as that nice hot early moment has faded was not my most pleasant experience. And do you know what? They cut that bit, it ended up on the floor. Pain for no gain whatsoever. And that's the last time I had a wet shave. Moving on. Hadrian has that lovely bronze head which sits in this museum, which actually was eventually cut off his statue and thrown in the River Thames. And ever so quickly, I'm going to get to one of the reasons why it might have been cut off, the statue, and thrown in the River Thames. And that's to do with this thing called the Hadrianic fire. And the Hadrianic fire has been known by archaeologists for quite a long time now. It's this beautiful, bright red layer that covers most areas of the settlement. It's shaded in red in the plan of the city there, showing how the now somewhat larger city, after its Flavian expansion, gets burnt down. And fire debris has been traced pretty much across all of that red area. The site on the left, Gresham Street, is one of the examples of what it looks like. You can see this quite handsome early Hadrianic mosaic, but if you look just above it, you can see a little kitchen area with all its pots fallen down from the shelves with the burnt black debris from the Hadrianic fire. And you can see how the clay-built walls have gone slightly orange because of the flames oxidizing the clay. And a large warehouse full of glossy Gallic pottery, known as Samian, provides some quite tight dating for it. Circa AD 125 is the date those pots were being imported. And we know that a couple of years later, dendrochronology suggests that aspects of the pot are being refurbished and brought back up to speed. So is this an accidental fire, like the Great Fire of London, 1666? Or are we looking at something a bit like the Boudiccan Fire, 1661? Is it accident or arson? I have a problem. The Emperor Hadrian has been getting a very good press ever since Edward Gibbon identified the Hadrianic period as the empire's peak of prosperity and happiness. And there is this blind spot to the fact that Hadrian's period involved some very messy and unpleasant wars. He was quite a nitpicking, difficult chap. Judea went up in flames, vast numbers of people died there. And we actually know from bits of history that there were problems in Britain. But people have still wanted to think, oh no, Hadrian, good chap. Roman emperors, Anyway. What we have after the Hadrianic fire, which could be an accident, or it could be arson. What we have after the Hadrianic fire is the building of a new fort. Do you remember after the Boudiccan revolt, a fort was built? This fort is built in the Hadrianic period. It tends to be called the governor's guard. You know, the governor has a guard, he has troops with him in London. Yeah, but governors in other periods didn't. This just happens after this fire's happened. There's still bits of it very well displayed. I say well displayed. The Noble Street thing needs tidying up from time to time. Occasionally it gets a bit weed covered, but it's still there and is also a testimony to the Blitz, which is why that site has been left vacant since then. So we've got this fort. There's also a big new military-style road built across the Walbrook to get across that soggy ground. Do you remember when you last saw one of those happening? You know, similar patterns. But also, those grey circles on there, running down the line of the Walbrook, are the sites of human crania. And within the stream, the Walbrook, we get these water-rolled skulls. And again, lots of arguments to and fro about how do those skulls end up in the water? Are they just washed out of upstream cemeteries? Well, nobody's found enough cemeteries yet to convince me that they come from any such cemetery. And some we know were lifted, reworked, and placed. This is the Crossrail site station, Elizabeth Line station being built at Liverpool Street, the extension for it. And you can spot to the left-hand side of the archaeologist of the Museum of London working away there, you can spot a little group of crania that have been brought. Now, some of these are already river-rolled, they've come down the river, but they've been taken out of a clogged-up bit of river, moved, and then placed at intervals in this roadside ditch. And this is actually one of these roads along, this is what I called the Military Way just a few seconds ago. Now, there are potentially natural causes, but we have, and I've used the phrase in publications, peak skull. We know that the Roman treatment of their defeated enemy, the Roman treatment of deserters, of traitors, was very harsh indeed. And not only did it involve execution, it would tend to involve denying the dead proper burial. Rome had a view about the spirit, the soul. It had a view that proper burial and the honor you paid to the dead was a very important part of treatment of the dead. Hence, lots of Roman cemeteries with grave goods and proper treatment. Departure from that is unusual. And that unusual departure is certainly testified in the Roman world as a product of corpse abuse. And you've got somebody who you are absolutely kicking into the dust. And the first thing you do is you start dismembering them. We've got all of these prescriptions we know about at the time of Octavian, where Cicero's head and hand were taken and stuck on spikes in the forum as to display that these enemies of state were being abused, not just in life, but in death. So there is a strong tradition of Roman corpse abuse, which involves treating skulls a bit differently. And water rolled, yes, because what did they do with all the victims of corpse abuse in Rome? They threw them in the Tiber or in the Cloaca Maxima. So you throw, and that helps wash away the impurity left by the corpse, remove it, but then if you find them again, they still have some degree of power left. So I am suggesting that these skulls placed, and there are hundreds of them from Hadrianic London, are there as a product of corpse abuse. I may be wrong. Interestingly, only 4 of these skulls went through the full isotopic analysis because it's an expensive process. Of those 4, and these are water-old skulls, these aren't people buried next to each other because they're cousins, these are people who've been fished out of a river, out of the Walbrook. 2 of those 4 individuals had grown up in a background of granitic geology of the sort found in the Scottish Highlands or potentially in Scandinavia. There are bits of the Central Massif in France that do the same, but the nearest source of granitic geology is the Scottish Highlands. So who is it that's been buried here after their bodies have been water-rolled? Bearing in mind, we're now looking at the decades after London has burnt down, the decades after that new fort was built on the side of the city, and bearing in mind that the head of Hadrian on display in this museum had been hacked off its statue at some point in time and thrown in the River Thames. I leave you to draw together the threads of that very unbalanced and I'm selling you a story. Buy the book and you can see some of the other arguments. There we go. So I'm sure I'm talking too long about the early stuff, because I always do. So I'm just going to zip along to get to plagues, because I've promised you plagues. London gets rebuilt after the Hadrianic Revolt. We've got dendrochronology. We've got inscriptions showing some quite handsome Antonine houses are built. We know temples are being built at this time. There's a Gresham Street temple you can see on the left. That's where these springs were on high ground. We've also got this lovely temple complex found at Tabard Square, not very far from the Shard, with this fantastic inscription. Yet again, we've got somebody involved in trade or supply. That's the nature of his title, Amorotix. And he also comes from these bits of Gallia Belgica that have a long relationship with supporting London. And that's probably a dedication slab from an Antonine temple. But sometime in the probably 160s, and the arguments over chronology are difficult, but probably sometime in the 160s, London goes through a massive, massive contraction. We have got this evidenced by just the amount of pottery found in London. That's the top slide showing you sherds per decade, and you'll see there that there's a falling off between our busy 130s, 140s, 150s into our pretty mediocre 160s. That falling off is reflected in the fact also that local pottery kilns cease production, but also we have dereliction on a range of city sites. Now, our description of dereliction is very difficult because you're arguing about absences rather than presences. And one of the biggest problems we have is that dereliction is that what were built areas become open ground, and that open ground accumulates, I'm going to call it garden soil, which I'm sure a soil micromorphologist would tell me off for calling it garden soil, but it is an earth that has worms going through it, that has roots that penetrate it, and it mixes. And as you mix, of course, the roots and the worms penetrate into the underlying materials, and so they can eat the stratigraphy. And there is definitely a case here of somebody's eaten my stratigraphy. Or, yeah, and I do think that we can pin the date into the 160s, primarily going back to dendrochronology and the fact that timber supply to London starts seeing a major interruption. We don't get new imports of timber for building works either. And that takes us on to what's going on in the 160s. There are various mechanisms that you could describe it as being part of, but we do know that London in the 2nd century was in dread fear of the plague of Galens, the Antonine plague. This was perhaps the first encounter of Western Europe with smallpox. If we think about what happens to South America at a different point in time. And this plague has exercised many arguments amongst ancient historians, which I will not get closely engaged in because you don't have the next 48 hours to spend listening to them. But those arguments don't change the fact that there are sources that describe plague, and in London we have this pewter amulet rolled into a strip containing a spell, and this spell uses the wording drawn from an oracle that pronounced about how to protect yourself from this plague, known as the Plague of Galens, through the physician who described it. And that oracular use of it refers to Phoebus, another name for Apollo, because Apollo the archer, Trojan Wars, sends the plague. And somebody in London threw this onto the Thames foreshore, where it gets found by archaeologists. And it does suggest that plague has been a cause of fear locally. And we've also got the arrival of one of these cults. We start seeing several statues of Apollo the archer from temple sites and related sites. And again, this would look to be prophylactic, people responding to the fear of plague with certain forms of devout behavior. We have 3 of these statues of Apollo the archer. So the model I'm presenting is that of a major plague in which London sees massive contraction. I didn't run through the stats of the sites I showed you with continuity and discontinuity, but there was a map there which showed how many sites show evidence of abandonment of this period, and a contraction of between 1/3 and 2/3 of the occupied area at this date. It takes London a generation to get back together again, and it gets back together again in a very familiar fashion. We start to see imperial interest because of military campaigns. We see it through the waterfront, and the Thames waterfront sees a series of rebuilding exercises dating from the 190s into the early 3rd century. And that revival is troops going, to start with, the other way, I would argue. One of our waterfronts is certainly earlier than the AD 197 waterfront I'll mention in a second. But that waterfront, built probably in the 190s, late 180s, early 190s, looks likely to be contemporary with the governorship of Clodius Albinus. And Clodius Albinus famously pitches for imperial purple, puts British troops onto boats sailing from London t'other off to continental Europe. And in doing so, denudes the province of troops, but needs to marshal people, needs to marshal goods. So London's port, perhaps seeing that building work. This is not precisely dated. What is precisely dated is that waterfront sees further major, more substantial engineering works in AD 197. And in AD 197, precisely dated by dendrochronology, that is the year in which Clodius Albinus had been defeated in battle outside Lyon, had been killed, his head was stuck on a spike and taken away, and Clodius Albinus is being replaced by the Severus. Well, Severus is already in power in the east, but Severus is now establishing his dominion over the entire empire. And the building of London's big waterfront of the late 2nd century, early 3rd century, is precisely dated to the year in which the new governor, acting for Severus, Virius Lupus, arrives in Britain. And so you're going back the other way again. You've taken your troops out to go to Gaul, and it's whoops, back the other way. Britain is seeing building works, I believe, associated with these military campaigns. And all of this moves forward to a bit which I'm really going to skim past, which is the rebuilding of London in the early 3rd century, under the Severan dynasty, the back end of it. And it does look as if London gets its town wall in a phase of urban reform, as York is being set up to have a smaller province ruled from York, and London is being given a new provincial boundary and territory, and the city has been given walls, because the late Roman city becomes this walled enclave of administrative power, but for a smaller province in southern Britain. And how am I doing for time? Can I give you one more plague? One more plague? All right. I'm afraid it means you missed the Temple of Mithras, but everyone knows about the Temple of Mithras. And if you don't, you should. The next plague is something I've come to very slowly, And I started as an archaeologist. When I started looking at the plague of Galens and the 2nd century plague, it was because of this neglect of urban sites. I'm an archaeologist, I dig these things, I'm going, what's gone wrong? Why aren't people carrying on building, doing what they've been doing before? Plague of Galens, mid-160s. Another set of weird things happens to the archaeology of London in this sort of mid-3rd century period. And that is that waterfront, you've just seen how waterfront rebuilding to support these military campaigns of Clodius Albinus and Severus, new waterfronts, nice waterfronts, handsome waterfronts, lovely timbers. And what they do with that is that they chop away the waterfront revetments along the full length of the waterfront. And they are removing timbers and creating a slope up, and then they're digging, or perhaps the watercourse is cutting, a little channel at the base. But that port, the port that had sustained London all the way through, that made London what it was, is suddenly, we don't want it anymore. And the cost of building it, and then the effort of destroying it, is significant. The port was redundant. And we know from the amphora that were used for bringing in the wine and oil, but they're stopping coming in anything like the same quantities. We know that regional production, which I've hardly touched upon, but wheeled and ironworking, salt works in the Thames estuary, forestry management, all of those things are also seeing interruptions in this mid-3rd century date. Now, once again, as with the plague of Galens and the problems of the 160s, we're looking at trying to build an argument from absences, from things that have been destroyed and taken away. And archaeology always finds that much harder. But back to our dendrochronology. We know that these waterfronts were being improved and rebuilt and worked on up until the 240s. 241, dendro date, Guy's Hospital. We also have other bits of construction work going on up until AD 252. And that is a dendro date that then sees nothing happening for the next 15, 20 years. There's a gap after it. So something's happened around AD 252, AD 253. And that leads into something archaeologists and ancient historians describe as the 3rd century crisis. Again, that's another 48-hour chat you won't get from me now. But that had a combination of bad things going on. Political crisis, foundation of something called the Gallic Empire. It split away from the rest of the empire. We have Frankish piracy. We know pirates are a problem now on the seas, they're referred to. How big a problem is disputed. Frankish piracy might be a sensible reason for putting a defensive bank where previously you had an open port. Question mark. But the key thing in this, for me, having seen what goes on in the 160s, is it echoes to me. And the plague of Cyprian is another of these plagues which people don't quite know the scale and importance of it, but it is described by Cyprian, a bishop of Carthage. We know it has effects elsewhere in the empire. Kyle Harper's written a lovely book about these plagues, well worth buying after you've bought my book. But do see what Kyle Harper says about plagues. He overstates some aspects of the case, but his base arguments are very sound indeed, and I certainly subscribe to them. But what we're seeing in London, we don't know that plague affects London. We do not know. But if plague stops people turning up for work, if it stops people wanting to live in big cities, if it stops people manning the boats, you've got a situation in which frontiers get weakened. The military isn't able to support boundaries in the same way. You get a situation in which Frankish piracy might be allowed to flourish. You get a situation in which people might not want a port in London anymore. And this 3rd century crisis, driven by the plague of Cyprian, I say driven by, I've leapt several steps too far ahead of my professional colleagues. One might argue that this plague of Cyprian has an impact on manpower and Rome's ability to structure and deliver. And if you go back to London's role as a port that's supplying oil and wine to troops, this is the point at which empire says, I'm sorry, you're going to have to find your alcohol local. We can't send you olive oil. You might have to find something that you can produce more locally, tallow for your candles, whatever. And there is a rebalancing of production in Britain around more local supply. We are seeing the end of some of these longer networks of supply to support the army. And it's driven by, I think, manpower crises, partly war, partly Frankish piracy, partly plague, partly economic. But in there, the trigger, I do think, is potentially plague. And the what's going on is something called path dependency. Rome had carried on supplying its troops in Britain as if they were still campaigning troops, as if they're still off fighting battles, where you've got to give them all of the grain they need, all of the wine they need, all of the oil they need. And actually, those supply networks had outlived that period of campaigning activity. We saw the change of the 2nd century, the creation of a splitting up of the province, London no longer being the main entrepot through which trade is moved. So that shift to the annona, and the annona is the name given to the supply of grain to Rome, but also to other forms of administered supply, that shift is potentially driving these changes in local production, and is potentially a product of the diminished nature of the urban settlements, such as London. And that's my second plague. I'm afraid you're going to have to buy the book if you want to know about what happens in the 130 odd years that I'm not going to talk about. Thank you. I only got halfway through today.
Many, many thanks for a really fascinating lecture, Dominic. And I'm sure we've got some questions. I'll be checking my phone, forgive me, because some might have come through online. But are there any in the room? If you put your hand up, sitting gentle at the back, please. Get my steps in.
Thank you very much. Fascinating lecture. One of the things, and this probably is like a major topic of its own accord, but how significant do you think London was? And I'm sure it would have varied through the period of the Roman Empire. How significant a city, looking at the Roman Empire as a whole, do you think London was, compared, say, to Trier, Lutetia, and of course the huge cities of the Eastern Mediterranean?
I guess it's about whether you think size counts. London was at its peak. People have guesstimated that it has 25,000 odd in terms of population. It's very difficult to know, but that's by looking at building density and guessing how many people live in each house and how many buildings there are, and various models apply. But I think 25,000 is sort of a good round figure to play with. If it is 25,000 at its peak, and here we're looking at about the late 1st, early 2nd century, that would make it significantly larger than your average small country town, as it were, where 8, 10, 12,000 is more common. Of course, that's peak London, and it's still nowhere near as significant a site politically, or probably in terms of population, as the likes of Trier, which operates as an imperial capital for far more of its life. But in terms of significance, London has more to tell us about the ancient world than some of those other cities where we do not have the quality of archaeological data from which to build the sorts of narrative and the many speculations. And I have been very speculative today, but those speculations are only possible because London is important. And London was important to Rome, not just us. It was important because Britain had 4 legions in the earlier part of the Roman period. That made it politically very powerful. Roman emperors were put in place and kept in place by a mix of factors, but primarily by the army at most times. And if the army wasn't on your side, you weren't going to be emperor for particularly long. And Britain, therefore, needed to be swayed. And London was the vehicle through which the province was swayed. Obviously, from the Hadrianic period onwards, with the creation of Hadrian's Wall, with the shift of political power further north and the rise of York as a rival, as a separate settlement, these begin to make London wane a little bit in importance. And when you hit late antiquity, London is a much diminished site, and it's a bureaucratic centre. It's walled. It's still used as a base of operations, but it's nothing like the place it was.
I'll just read one out online. So what was it that attracted the Romans to Britain to spend so much money in maintaining their presence?
Ooh, that's probably a better question for an ancient historian than an archaeologist. We are looking at politics, and emperors need to establish their legitimacy They need to define why it is they are helping the empire thrive. They need to find ways of rewarding the legions that support them in their power. So if you think Roman politics, and if you think about how Claudius is trying to make his mark, and then Vespasian later on, and other emperors do, you can see a strategy there that makes sense. I don't want to stray into contemporary warfare, but I can think of a current situation which may not make an enormous amount of economic sense, but was a political decision because of an emperor-like figure.
And any other questions in the room? This gentleman down in the third row, please. Thank you.
How do you think that the plagues you're talking about compare with the Justinian plague and the Black Death?
I think an email to Carl Harper is in order here. I don't think that we can draw comparisons because we don't have the primary evidence that allows them. One of the biggest problems when I talk about plagues, people shy away a bit from it because we can't find them. People who die of plague just look like dead people. And if you are cremating remains, as happens through the earlier periods, there's nothing demographic to get to grips with. The sources themselves, on one side, exaggerate what's going on because later Christian authors want to make Roman Empire plague, you're being punished for your sins, whatever. So maybe they exaggerate. On the other hand, imperial sources perhaps understate things because they want people to be happy with the order and not. So we don't have the tools that let us describe it. If we were to look at the later plagues, and the Justinianic one is more readily understood as a major turning point in Roman history, and of course the Black Death, we actually have a lot more historical and documentary material to play with, and also their plague cemeteries are easier to identify. So I think that those later episodes are more visible and may have been bigger, but I go back to, if we look at particularly Antonine plague rather than the plague of Cyprian, London, I think, is not back from, and I've just given the figure of about 25,000, I think it probably is not back down to about 10 to 15,000 people. And if that was just London, you go, all right, that's a city that's a port, it's been a bit more adversely affected than other places. But as you look around the Roman world, and I've dug in Milan and Beirut and other places, and I find that late 2nd century is always a bit iffy. The stratigraphy is not quite there. We don't have the dendrodating to be able to pin down why change and when change is happening in the same way that we do in London. But I actually think that many, many cities in the Roman world were adversely affected by the plague of Galens. I think it is an understated episode in history. And I think if it were Europe's first encounter with smallpox, we don't have to look and think very hard about what it did to Latin America and South America to realize it might have been really quite devastating. But it doesn't come through in our source material, and that's, it leaves me able to speculate, but on the other hand, it doesn't leave me able to give you a proper answer.
Another question from the theatre. This lady in the back row, please.
What proportion of the population were, if you like, Roman and expat, as it were, and what proportion were born in Britain?
I mean, we're talking about a long period of history, and obviously it would have changed at different times. London is essentially supported by immigration, as I would argue it pretty much always has been. But in the Roman period, it starts out as being very immigrant-driven. I think that the settlement on the north side of the river, the material culture we see there is directly imported from Gallia Belgica, from the German frontier. We also have the advancing work on isotopic analysis, DNA and other forms of ancient DNA, which also point to subsequent waves of immigration. Going back the earliest period, we have to rely on material culture because cremation was the burial rite of common practice, and we simply do not have enough human remains to be able to model demographically. But once you move into the later antiquity, when inhumation is more commonly practiced, we also have ancient DNA showing waves of subsequent immigration. We know of quite a lot of North Africans. Work in Southwark has produced Chinese in Roman London. This is a city that was always very cosmopolitan. And in its material culture, the British, it tends to be very peripheral. Early doors, we get a few round circular buildings built in Iron Age tradition. They're all of them in the suburban, extra-urban areas. They tend to be in quite cramped little compounds. They tend to have quite poor material culture associated with them. They do look like either, well, I suspect some are actually directly slaves, but they're certainly lower status in terms of their material culture. And I don't think that's cultural preference. I think that is because they're a subordinate community, but others would argue different.
Thank you. One more online. Do you think that London would currently be very different if it had not been for the Romans?
Ooh, now that... Our conception of self would be different. London, as it is today, is re-established in the Roman site because of the rising relevance of both the church and kingship as as England becomes politically more unitary. And those changes deliberately draw on the background. I didn't have time to run through what goes on in the later period of Roman rule in Britain, but most of our churches in the city, I say most, probably not most, but a significant minority of the churches in the city are built over the sites of higher status Roman buildings. Now, that's not because of continuity. We know there isn't continuity. What that is because of is that those earlier structures were still known of as sites of people were here. And those late antique people were considered to be Christians. These were, so if you've got the remains of a Christian house, you build your new church around that earlier Christian house. I believe it to be a reinvention, not continuity, but that reinvention is, of course, what modern London is all about. We are reinventing ourselves and drawing on those historical backgrounds. The value of crossing the Thames here exists when there is a bridge. And when there's London Bridge, London works. When there isn't London Bridge, it tends not to. I know we've got lots now, but you get the point. It is because we are uniting the river with its ability to move goods with the road systems that radiate from it. And that would have been the case in the mid to late Saxon period, regardless of whether the Romans had ever been here, because those are geographically determined.
I think we've got time for two more questions. So this lady down the second row, please.
Can I just ask what Frankish means?
Franks.
Frankish piracy?
Yes, the Franks. The Franks are the people who gave their name to modern-day France.
Oh, sorry, I kept thinking that would be Gaelic.
No, Franks. But we were talking about Franks are moving on to the scene. Just as we're English, not Romans, so the people of France are French, not Gauls.
Thank you. And one more, just in the back row, please. Thank you.
Yes, it is common. London goes through several phases of reinvention in its early stages, and I've described 43 when there are probably tents and no roads. I described 48 when there are a few roads, and then I described 52, 53 when there's a big grid laid out. Now, orthogonal planning, rectangular planning, is seen as the way to put together a civilized community because people's rights are established by property holding. And I do believe when London is given its grid is when you can probably say, oh, this is now looking pretty urban here. But grid planning is also common to Roman forts. It's common to Roman forts because they're borrowing the idea from what a good town should look like. But the background of this, of course, goes back to Hippodamus and back into the ancient Greece. The Romans are buying into an idea of how polities should structure themselves. Orthogonal planning, very much the case. Once cities start to grow, you then make and mend, add, do bits. And cities' organic growth is often retained because that organic growth has become sanctified by practice and by the gods, and you don't mess with landscape. Rome is actually very, very interested in planting people on landscape and making the two have a good dialogue. A grid, you're following the course of the sun, you're creating something which is natural as well as unnatural, and that matters. Sorry, I could go off on a long urban town planning. Fascinating. Next talk.
Great. Just to reiterate, a huge, huge thank you to Dominic for a really wonderful lecture tonight.
And do buy the book. The book's got lots more in it.
Any unanswered questions, I'm sure they're answered in the book. But thank you so much for coming. I think there's an announcement for everyone on site shortly. But if you joined us online, have a wonderful rest of the evening, and we hope to see you again soon. Thank you.